So I'm really happy to introduce today Professor Paul Rowe. He's a Professor of Computer Science at Queensland University of Technology, and he's going to be telling us a little bit today about the Australian Acoustic Observatory. For the past 10 years, Paul has been researching how sound can be used for biodiversity monitoring in a discipline called ecoacoustics, and his research group is a world leader in the field. It's developing novel human-in-the-loop machine learning technologies to analyse data and innovative data visualisations and summaries. Paul works with ecologists, data scientists and citizen scientists, and he leads the Australian Acoustic Observatory project, which is building a network of 400 sensors which will collect sounds from all over Australia. This will result in a unique sound archive of over 2 millennia of sound data. Paul has published over 150 papers and received over 10 million Australian dollars, I guess, in competitive research funding. And Paul is joining us today from Brisbane, where it's the evening, so we're especially grateful that he's put some time aside in his evening to tell us a bit about his work. So over to you, Paul. I think you're going to talk to us for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions at the end.
Yeah, something like that. Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for inviting me to talk. Let me just share my screen. There we go. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep. Awesome. Great. Yes, so I'm going to talk a bit about the Australian Acoustic Observatory, which is a project which has been, I guess, more than sort of 10 years in the making. I wasn't that sure about the audience, so I've kept this all fairly general. Sometimes I sort of talk to more sort of technical audiences about computer science things, and other times I talk to sort of ecologists, and they ask me lots of hard questions that I'm not able to answer. So what I'm really going to do is just talk about these three words of Australian Acoustic and Observatory. So hopefully I'll talk for half an hour or so, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and I'll also sort of show you some sort of demos of some of our sort of sound and some of the data that we've already collected. So the first thing, a little bit about me is, originally I'm from the UK, but I live in Brisbane in Australia now, which is where that red star is. And originally my background is in computer science. My alma mater is York University, and I kind of went after my PhD, went off backpacking and then didn't come back and stayed in Australia. But I kind of moved through sort of computer science, doing fairly traditional computer science research and programming languages and things, through to sort of e-science and e-research and things like that, to sort of ecoacoustics. So now I spend most of my time, I spend as much time talking to ecologists as I do computer scientists. I even have some of my students who are really ecology students, sort of masquerading as computer scientists, and vice versa. So that's me, or me and a koala, sort of two grey-haired mammals. So one thing that I've sort of talked to some people in the UK before, and one of the interesting things is that, I mean, Australia is really quite different from the UK, which is one of the reasons why I sort of stayed. I mean, it's obviously sort of very big and sparsely populated, but one of the differences is that there's a lot that's still not known about Australia and about its environment and about its ecology. So, you know, the people are still finding new plant species, new vertebrate species, and we don't know where things are. So, you know, we don't know, in some cases, say for something like koalas, we don't really know how many koalas there are around, where they are. We don't know if their ranges are sort of shrinking as a result of sort of climate change and things like that. So there's a lot that's unknown about the ecology in Australia. That's quite different from Europe. And so that makes it kind of quite sort of challenging. It's obviously sort of sparsely populated, so you haven't got people, you know, people only really sort of live around the edges. The environment's also very sort of fragile. It's incredibly dry. And it's also mega diverse. So what that means is that we've got a lot of sort of crazy animals. We've got, you know, obviously kangaroos and koalas and things. but there really are a lot of species which are endemic to Australia. So, you know, there's to say sort of about 80% of the species just don't occur anywhere else. And because of the environment being so sort of fragile, because it is, you know, second driest continent, it means there's an extreme risk from even kind of moderate climate change. And because not much is often known about species and their distributions, there's, you know, a great concern in Australia about declines, and there have been quite severe declines in terms of the sort of animal and you know, and sort of floral vegetation sort of populations. So some of the sort of, you know, the sort of bad news, the sort of ABC Four Corners program, which is a, because the ABC is like the BBC, Four Corners is, I'm not quite sure what the equivalent would be. Perhaps it used to be what Panorama would be. I haven't sort of lived in the UK for a long time now. But anyway, there was a big sort of expose through one of their programs a couple of years ago with the sort of tag title Extinction Nation. And in fact, even today, so this is some news which just sort of came out today, which is really sad. So it's talking about this beautiful bird called the Regent Honeyeater. So this is news from like 17th of March today. And the species are becoming so rare that some of the juvenile males, there aren't enough of the other males around whom they normally learn their bird calls from, but they're learning the calls of other species, of other bird sort of species. There's only about 300 pairs of these birds around, and you know, the sort of 150 males and the sort of the young males are not actually learning their sort of traditional sort of song. So not only have we got this critically endangered bird, but there's also something kind of rather sort of sad happening in terms of its sort of song. So Australia's got an extinction, you know, unenviable extinction crisis. It's actually got the worst mammal extinction rate in the world. It's got a sort of over 500 animal species on this threatened species list. And a lot of them are not monitored. So not only are these species at extreme risk of sort of disappearing forever, but we also don't know how many there are. We don't know where they are. We don't know if their populations are in sort of rapid decline. Often, you know, the government and community organizations then make kind of interventions. They build in some places sort of things like exclosures, where they'll build a fence around a large area to sort of keep predators and feral species out, with the idea of trying to preserve the species on the inside of the fence, these exclosures. But again, there's excuse me, there's not a lot of monitoring that's done, so we don't actually know how things are changing. We don't really know what's going on, and that's quite different from other places. And it's because it's just such a large continent, and also it's quite inaccessible. So a lot of my ecologist colleagues they'll do sort of trips out into the bush. They'll go to the desert and things like that. And of course, the desert's a pretty inhospitable place. So they, you know, when they do their once sort of annual trip out to the desert, they'll do that in the winter. They'll go out there for, you know, just a week and do some observations, come back again. We won't know what's going on at other times of the year. And of course, in desert areas and places like that, often things only change and you only know what's going on when you do get some rain, or you do get some sort of trees flowering or something like that, and that's sort of hard to predict. And if it does rain, then you can't get out there anyway, and so you can't then discover whether, you know, we've got these beautiful kind of burrowing frogs and even fish that only sort of appear when you get rain. So you also, you know, it's very hard to know what's going on because you can't get to these places to do the monitoring when things are sort of happening. So we just don't know a lot about what's sort of happening. Monitoring is kind of important. I mean, sometimes people will say to me, "Oh, but you know, monitoring is only a small part of the, you know, of the issue. That, you know, we need to actually doing some kind of intervention. All monitoring is going to do is tell us some sort of bad news." You know, we don't really sort of learn anything from monitoring, and that's not really true, because really, if you're going to do anything, if you're going to, you know, if you're going to sort of manage things, then you need to be able to, you know, you need to sort of measure what's going on, as the sort of saying goes. And if you also really want to make change, you need to sort of engage people. And again, then if you're going to engage people, you need to be able to sort of show them what's happening, or you need to be able to explain to them and understand what's sort of changing. And so if you are expending some effort in terms of trying to rehabilitate or restore some land, then you need to be able to monitor that and see what the effect is. If you're going to have environmental offsets that companies, mining companies and people may use, you need to be able to sort of monitor that. So there's a whole sort of green accounting and green auditing aspect to this. Fundamentally, we often don't know things like, where the koalas are. We've often got in the case of koalas, for example, we've got historical records where they are. And we know where they are, near centres of sort of population where there are people, but where there aren't people, it's pretty hard to sort of spot koalas. And I have sort of been out doing that. It's a very sort of manual and labour-intensive operation. And we really need some way to sort of scale those kind of monitoring efforts. The other thing that I think a lot of people have realised recently, unfortunately, is that monitoring, even with only a kind of minimal feedback, can be surprisingly powerful. So, if you want to lose weight, one of the best ways is just to weigh yourself, because just that sort of feedback of regularly weighing yourself tends to mean you keep an eye on your weight and realise, when you have eaten too much or if your sort of weight's heading in the wrong direction. And even with things like kind of COVID, you can, if you have very, very good monitoring, and you can use that quite successfully to sort of manage COVID, if you know where it is, if we can get to the stage, and we're sort of getting there. I think they're talking about 15-minute tests now, where if everyone can kind of take a test sort of every morning and know if they've got COVID or not, and therefore whether they should sort of go out, stay at home, then that's quite an effective way to actually manage COVID, even without having kind of vaccines and things. You just need this very, very good sort of monitoring technique. So monitoring is really, really, really important. So that's really the sort of the Australian part of it, and why we, particularly in Australia, we need this monitoring in order to sort of understand the environment, as well as to kind of engage people and understand what's sort of happening. The next part is about the sort of acoustic sort of side of that, and why acoustics is a useful tool and a good tool for environmental monitoring. So traditional faunal monitoring looks like this. It's very manual. People actually go out into the field, and the ecologists obviously love going out into the field and looking for and kind of collecting animals and kind of counting things. But in a big country like Australia, or even in a small country, this obviously just doesn't get you very far. In the end, we have to sort of extrapolate greatly in order to understand what's really going on. And often we can't even do that. So often what will happen is we'll use something like, we'll use some sort of remote sensing or something like that, where we'll look at perhaps the sort of vegetation that's around using satellite imagery or something like that. And literally what's assumed is that, if a certain type of grassland is there, or if you've got a certain type of forest or trees or a rainforest, the assumption is that since the trees are there, the animals, the birds and things must also be there too, and yet we don't really know. The other issue, unfortunately, is that the way that a lot of this sort of manual monitoring works is that there's no sort of true record of the environment. So, when we see these sort of dreadful pictures of sort of glaciers melting and things like that, it's sort of, it's incontrovertible, and that we know that that's really happening. Everyone can look at the pictures from the Landsat satellites, and we can see that, the glaciers are getting smaller. And similarly, we can see kind of bits of the Amazon being kind of burnt and the trees being kind of cut down. That's not the case with if you're doing fauna monitoring, because typically we get different people going out, different levels of expertise, consultants going out, told to check for if there are, some rare species there, or any something which should be of environmental concern before some development can occur. But of course, there's no real record of what's happened. It's almost just one person's word against another. And so, we get these, fights between, kind of conservation groups and developers and things like that. And there's no hard, direct evidence about what's actually occurred. So we need some better ways of monitoring. And remote sensing, as I've mentioned, it works very well. Remote sensing not only provides a way to scale vegetation monitoring through sort of satellites, or even just using drones for that matter, which are taking various kind of image-based data, but the data that those instruments collect is sort of kept. So not only are we able to scale this monitoring, but we also can kind of keep the data and go back to it. And that's really important because it means that we're not reliant on a particular expert kind of going out or being there in the field. One of the problems with this sort of traditional form of monitoring here is that, you know, if you've got some people who are, for example, looking for birds, if they encounter a rare frog, they may not, you know, be experts in frogs. Perhaps they can sort of take a photo of it, perhaps, but in general, unless you've got a kind of a large entourage of different experts, it may be very difficult to know what you have in these different areas. But again, if you've got some record, if you've got something like remote sensing where you can actually capture the data and make that available to everyone for, you know, citizen science, but also for other experts to look at, that's a very powerful thing, because not only have you got a record that everybody can look at, and then you can really sort of find out about the state of some, perhaps a piece of land that, you know, perhaps is sort of up for development and whether that development should go ahead or not. But it also gives you a way to, I think, bring the observations to a wider group of people and a wider group of experts. And so effectively, you know, we've got a kind of a data-driven sort of science, and that's what we want to do for fauna. So here we go. So the idea for, you know, what I do, this sort of ecoacoustics work, is really to use sound collection and analysis to scale fauna surveys. So we want to put out these recorders into the environment to essentially listen to vocal species. So to listen to particularly kind of birds, frogs, some mammals, some sort of insects, you know, Orthoptera and things like that, which make a noise. And from that, the idea is we can then kind of understand how the environment is changing and what's going on. So, you know, we've got a kind of a pipeline a bit like this where we're putting out these recorders in the environment. They're recording, perhaps continuously recording. We're collecting that data and then analysing the data to understand which sort of species and things are calling. So probably time that I actually played some sound. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
Paul,
Yeah.
I don't think, I can't hear it. What you need to do when you go on to share computer screen, you need to click the button in the square in the bottom left hand corner, share computer sound. So if you could come out, if you could stop share, go back into share and click that, then it will work.
Okay, so Janet, where's the button on the share? Is this on the audio?
Sorry, I was muted. Go into share screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before you pull up your PowerPoint, click share sound.
Oh yes.
Got
Very
it?
good. Thank you. Yep. Yep. Awesome. Okay, let's try this again, see if this works. It is pretty quiet, so let's try.
That works, yeah.
Awesome. So in a nutshell, that's the kind of thing which we're trying to do. We want to be able to analyze, you know, collect sound and analyze that and have that provide a record of the environment and what's going on. There's a lot of sort of hardware that's out there at the moment. So in particular, there's these sort of open source audio moth devices that Alex Rogers and the guys from sort of Southampton have produced, these sort of tiny little recorders. And the great thing is that the recorders can be potentially deployed by non-experts. And that's a big advantage over some of the other techniques, like using kind of drones or even things like kind of eDNA and things like that, where you may need experts to sort of take the samples or to sort of fly the drones and things like that. So what I'm going to do now, I want just to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've done in the past, just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the kinds of monitoring that you can do. A lot of what's happened up until now has been single species monitoring, where we just monitor one species. And the idea of that is just to sort of understand that one species, maybe a sort of threatened species or some species of high kind of conservation value, or it may indeed be a kind of a pest species. And what we're moving towards now with ecoacoustics is doing kind of large-scale general biodiversity monitoring. So we've worked, for example, looking at some sort of rare sort of frog species with some of my colleagues from the University of Queensland. Let's play the frog sound. And in particular, in this project, what we were doing was trying to sort of understand, and this was the result of some development work that had gone on, how to sort of recreate these slightly acidic ponds that this Wallam sedge frog wants. But if the acidity and if the other conditions are not quite right, then this sort of very common other frog will sort of move in. And so in order to monitor the frogs, we were using acoustics to do that. Some work with another student, Danny Teixeira. She was looking at some threatened bird species, in particular these sort of black cockatoos. You may be more used to the sort of sulfur-crested white cockatoos. And she was actually strapping recorders onto trees to actually detect the sort of sounds of fledgling events. So to actually detect the different sounds that the young will make. And so you can literally detect whether a nest has been successful and the young birds have survived and sort of flown out and haven't been predated or anything like that. Some cockatoo calls. I haven't normalized the sound, so some of these may be rather loud. Other work, we've looked at how changes, phenological changes in flowering and the kind of common tree species and things that people have in their backyards are causing changes to flying foxes. So these are these bats, and this is particularly topical now because these bats are a source of zoonotic disease. So they actually carry a Hendra virus, which is quite a nasty disease, a little bit like kind of rabies. And again, in order to sort of monitor these, we've been using kind of acoustic recorders. So again, it's all about monitoring a sort of a single species. We've also been involved in projects where we've built a kind of an early warning system to detect cane toads. So cane toads are an invasive introduced species in Australia, and some islands are natural island arcs that don't have the cane toads on them, and often people will reintroduce threatened species and vulnerable species to these islands. So they literally act like arcs. One of the important things, of course, is then to stop the invasive species, the foxes or cats or cane toads, from getting onto these islands. And so we've actually built systems that act as a sort of an early warning system and generated sort of a text message should these species arrive. The key thing is, though, we're still just looking at sort of single species. I'll play that. This is a toad call. Particular call. And we've also done work with sort of koalas, looking at how to census koalas, and we've built, along with some sort of my ecology colleagues, we're looking at kind of occupancy modeling and things like that, so we can either start to get some, at least sort of surrogates for abundance and things like that to understand where koalas are and aren't. So again, here's one of these recorders, this is one of the wildlife acoustics recorders that's strapped to a tree. And the male koalas in the breeding season have this sort of rather strange donkey sort of pig-like bellowing sound. A lot of very strange animals in Australia. So these are some of the projects which we're still involved with and have been involved with in the past. So really, acoustics really provides a new way for us to sort of understand the environment, how things are changing. we can certainly get these basic metrics that ecologists like to use. There's a presence absence, just is a species there or not. We can get some ideas of sort of populations and abundance through sort of surrogates, doing things like occupancy modeling and things. And also, if we understand a bit about the behavior of the species, sometimes we can understand a bit about their interactions. So we may be able to detect both predator and prey species, the interactions of species. We can detect whether, sort of fledgling success and things like that. I mean, in the case of the koalas, I mean, if we detect things like the male koalas are bellowing, and that's a bit of an indication of there being a healthy population, because it's saying there are these healthy males there that want to breed. And then, people are doing all sorts of things with acoustics now. So we even hear things like the Perseverance rover and things are sort of sent back from audio from Mars. So audio is very much something whose sort of time has come, and it's perhaps something that we haven't paid a lot of attention up until now. So that sort of in some ways summarizes, probably the last 10 years of my work, not the Mars rover, but at least the monitoring of all these different sort of species. And it's been very much about this single species monitoring. And because my background is in sort of e-science and things, I've always had this sort of thought that we should be able to reuse all this data, that, we're collecting this huge data set. We must be able to mine this data set for all these different recordings for other things. So although perhaps we've, been sort of looking for koalas, there should be some other interesting data in all of this sort of koala data we've been collecting. But in fact, that hasn't happened. What we found is that with this sort of single species monitoring, and where you're targeting just one species, the sort of protocols, the sort of sampling, the design that tends to be set up tends to be very, very specific for that particular species. And so it's actually very, very hard to reuse the data. So, what we've really wanted to do is to turn general fauna monitoring, so for biodiversity, not just a single species, into this more data-driven science. And we wrote a paper a long time ago about this, and that's really, where we've gone with this sort of acoustic observatory. So then the sort of the observatory part of what we've done, and this is our sort of most recent effort in this space, is this. So the observatory, the vision of it was to create something like an astronomical observatory, where you kind of collect data, about sort of heavens, and you make that available to different scientists, citizen scientists, to look at and to analyze, and importantly, to pose their own questions about. So the idea is we're not necessarily looking for anything in particular. So it's rather different. So we want to do this for acoustics, to have this sort of acoustic observatory. But the thing that's a little different from previous studies, and the reason that this is quite unique, is that we're not targeting any one species. So this is very different from traditional ecology. Traditional ecology is it's a very traditional science where, you sort of start off with a question, you have a hypothesis, and you use that to design an experiment, collect some data to sort of validate your hypothesis. In this case, it's very much a data-driven, a data-first approach, where we're saying we want to collect data so that we can understand biodiversity. We don't have any, particular questions in mind. We just want to understand what's there and what's changing. So we're not targeting a particular sort of species. So what we wanted to do is to create really a new way of understanding the world, a new way of understanding biodiversity and what's sort of happening, and to provide this kind of, this sort of window into the world of acoustics and soundscapes. And so, there are a number of ways of doing this. People have tried and done some of these things in the past. So there's been sort of ideas where you could actually hook up acoustic recorders to things like meteorological stations. So as well as weather data, you'd also get some sort of sound data. There's sort of ideas, and people like Sarab Sethi has done this, where you have networked sort of stations that sort of collect data and send the data back over, 3G or 4G or 5G or something like that. And there have also been sort of citizen science sort of techniques. Unfortunately, things like, the using mobile telephony networks and things doesn't work that well, because most of Australia is not, whilst most of the population of Australia is covered by the telephony networks, most of the Australian continent, where the species are, those hard to reach places that we're interested in, are not covered. So, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my ecologist colleagues will go out and do these sort of surveys. They'll go out to some remote areas, perhaps just once a year, and survey an area. People like the government and the national parks, they will survey the national parks. They will go out and visit areas in the national parks. But a lot of the remote areas and things may only get visited once a year. You may need a helicopter to get there. Helicopters are expensive. It's not cheap to fly around in a helicopter. And so our idea essentially was to sort of piggyback this sort of data collection using these sort of acoustic recorders on the back of existing activities. So the idea really was to say, well, what about if you're going to go out and take a group of students out into the middle of the desert, it's going to be a 2-day trip to get there. You're going to spend about a week there. What would happen if you left a recorder there that was going to record 24/7, record for a whole year? And then next year, you go back and you collect the data from the recorder and find out what's happened when you weren't there, what's happened for the rest of the year. So really what we've done with the observatory is we're leveraging existing activities where people are already sort of going out to places, and we're using that as an opportunity to sort of collect data when people aren't there. So we're more, in some ways, what we've done is to enhance people's abilities rather than to have a completely sort of automated system. It's more about building on what people are already doing and what people have already been able to do. So basically, we put these standalone recorders out there, they record, someone comes back 6 months, a year later, we collect the data, and see what happens. This was some sort of early trials that we did in the Sturt Desert. That's some of our early recorders. And then a few years ago, we put in an infrastructure grant to get one of these large sort of pieces of sort of infrastructure, which normally go to these sort of physics and sort of traditional sort of scientists who have got some mass spectrometry machine or something like that. And we got a grant to sort of purchase these sensors and the storage of the sensors, which we were then able to sort of put out, form this acoustic observatory. So I think we've got about 360 of the sensors deployed sort of so far. So it's a 5-year project. So the way that it works out is you've got 400 sensors running over 5 years, collecting data. That means we're going to get sort of 2 millennia of data in total. So we've got sort of 2 petabytes of data over sort of 5 years, and all the data is going to be made sort of freely available, and it's to support ecology, computer science, education, and art sort of research. Let's skip that slide. I'll talk a little bit about some of the design goals and what we were trying to do. Fundamentally, we're interested in what, in general terms, what's sort of changing, what's there, what happens after an event where you might normally be able to get there if there is a fire or it does rain or something like that. And looking at things like phenological change and things like that. I'll just skip through some of this more ecological stuff. We basically, the way that we design the sensors is they're put into groups of 4. 2 of them are put in a kind of a wet area, perhaps along a river or maybe a dried up kind of creek bed or a watercourse, and the other 2 will be put a bit away from them in a sort of drier area. They're in the similar kind of representative area, but out of earshot, if you like, of one another. So we've got these sort of 4 points. So we've got some replication because we've got points in sort of similar areas, like near the water and away from the water, but they won't typically hear the same species in each area. So this is what our recorders look like. We've got a kind of a custom sort of recording box. It's about the size of a shoebox. They're they weigh about 4 or 5 sort of kilos. It was a sort of custom commercial design. They're sort of solar powered, and they sit on one of these sort of star pickets here. We can put sort of about 4 sort of SD cards in them. We record, so it's all about trade-offs in the end. What we've done, it was essentially infeasible 10 years ago, just because it wasn't feasible to store all of the data. So we record at 22 kilohertz. That means we can only represent up to 11 kilohertz, but we record continuously. We only record in mono. It means a fairly high gain, and it's compressed using FLAC. What that really means is that we're just trying to maximize the storage that we've got without sort of losing any data and being able to record kind of continuously. So it means that each recorder over a year will, accumulate about a terabyte of data. So we put a terabyte of SD cards in each of our recorders. And that's about the sweet spot at the moment in terms of what's sort of affordable and the price of recorders and things. In a few years' time, we'll probably be able to afford more storage, and therefore we'll be able to record at a higher rate if we wish to. But it really is about a set of trade-offs in the design. We've got about 100 of these sites, 4 of these things at each site. There's all sorts of, the great thing about working with ecologists is they're really into sort of logistics and things. It becomes really important. So this great invention here is a sort of fence post. It's called a star picket in Australia, and we use these for mounting our recorders. And it was really great that we were able to use these for mounting rather than the previous ones where we had to actually sort of concrete in these poles, because if you're going to deploy sensors, there's a lot of costs in transporting them and getting them to places. So things like these sort of basically fence posts, you can actually find usually reasonably close to where you actually want to deploy the sensors. The other thing is these fence posts just get banged in the ground. And again, if you're an ecologist, this is obvious, but you have to get permission, and there's a whole bunch of forms and things you need to fill out in order to deploy sensors. And there's a huge difference between banging something into the ground and concreting something into the ground. So the amount of extra sort of bureaucracy and things that you have to sort of say, and even whether you're going to get permission to do it, will actually change depending upon whether you've basically got a metal spike that you're going to bang into the ground and put your sensor on, or if you've got to have a sort of heavier weight thing that's going to be concreted in, which often you're not allowed to use, for example, in the national park. So there's all sorts of crazy stuff like that. We use these fishing tackle boxes to put all our SD cards in. We put some sort of sweets and things in there as hopefully further incentive to get people to actually make sure they really do sort of swap the SD cards out correctly and things. One of the things we did with the hardware company that was very cool is we wanted to make sure that it was very easy to set up the recorders. So the recorders themselves collect a lot of provenance. What that means is that they're quite self-describing. So they have a GPS unit on them, so we know where the data has come from. The GPS also gives us an accurate time measurement. The sensors have a number built into them, and that number is actually written to the data files as well. So the data files, we know where the recording was made, we know the time the recording was made. It's all done completely automatically, so no updating necessary. We know you've got the identification of the actual recording box that was used. We have the microphone identifier is also recorded. We even have the SD card. So SD cards actually have their own number embedded in them. And so we have that as well. So we know every single piece of hardware that was used to make that recording. And that's really important, because if we find that some recordings have sort of gone wrong or corrupt, we can identify that particular recorder, the particular SD card, even the particular microphone that was causing the problem. And so that's sort of really useful. It means that none of that has to be sort of manually sort of entered. So that's really good. It's almost completely self-describing. We've worked with a lot of landholders and managers, participants, and that's been sort of important. It's really in the end about the people, because we're sort of essentially piggybacking and running on existing activities and people's goodwill. I'm not going to talk much about the data analysis. All I'll say is that we've really got 3 ways to analyze data. We can use sort of citizen scientists, and we've got some projects coming out soon around that. We can manually listen to data. We've got some automated detectors that we use, and we use a variety of algorithms, including some convolutional neural networks and things like that. We also have our sort of soundscapes, our sort of acoustic indices, and we've pioneered some sort of visualization techniques around that, and I'll show you that very shortly. We've had some delays due to sort of COVID and bushfires, unfortunately, and we're also currently moving our system to a new set of servers. So it's a little bit sort of slow at the moment. We've got a bit of a backlog of data, but I can show you some sort of data from not from last year, but the year before. Let me show you some of the sort of pictures and play some sounds of some deployments that we've got. So this is some of our deployments all over Australia. This is one which is very kind of close to QUT. So this is in sort of Brisbane. So roughly speaking, it's sort of it's there. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's sort of, you know, roughly sort of halfway up on the right hand side there at Brisbane. That's just part of a this is one a little bit drier, so we're sort of moving west now. So this is sort of Bowra, which is a sort of a nature reserve further west, a bit drier. It's in the sort of these what are called mulga lands. This is dry still. This is moving even further west, southwest, really, to the middle of the sort of Sturt Desert. This is the Sturt Stony Desert. Little button quail and things in there. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up shortly. Let me, what I'll do is I'll show you just some sound from our sort of website, and then I'll sort of hand it over for some sort of questions. So let me just stop that share. Let me share, remember to share the sound on the observatory. So, this is some sort of annotated sound again from Samford, which is near Brisbane. So this is from sort of the observatory. Apologies. So there's a fanfare and yellow robin and a few other things there. We have a whole website and a cloud-based system for sort of storing the data. The data gets just sent in the form of these SD cards to us, and then sort of uploaded. This is when we had some sort of rain there, which is always good. Rain. There's still some sort of animal, birds and things falling there. This is in August in 2019. Now, 2020 data, a lot of it hasn't been uploaded yet because it's not sitting on the desk of someone who works for me who's about to upload it once that system's moved over. This? Oh, this is an owl. So this is quite often hear this in around Brisbane, owl at night. And finally, let me show you. This is a visualization tool that we have. What this visualization tool does is it enables us to view sound to a very large extent. So rather than just viewing sound via these sort of spectrograms, we can compress the sound and look at whole days or years worth of sound. And we can have this sort of almost a Google Maps-like interface to zoom into the sound. So I can actually sort of zoom into the sound here and look at it by this representation. I know this sort of pink is usually means there's some sort of rain there. So I'll now actually go and rain in a car. That gives you a bit of an idea about some of the things that we can do. So we've developed a whole suite of tools and things for also listening to the sound. I'll just go back to my slides. So we've got a lot of participants involved who I want to sort of acknowledge. Certainly want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and collect a lot of data. And obviously there's a whole bunch of people who have been involved with this, including my team at QUT and ecologists, Australian Research Council, who sort of funded this work, and you know, various sort of landholders and other people. And that's it. Thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got.